The prevailing sentiment among Western leaders seems to be that the only reason third world countries are poor is because they don't have capital right now, and they need said capital to build the necessary infrastructure for food production, education, and health services. We see billions of dollars shipped off to Africa and the Middle East every year in a pathological attempt to bring them up to similar living standards with the West and developed Asia. But year after year, the problems just don't go away. In fact, in many ways, they just tend to get worse. How could it be that after so much money being given to these countries, they're still in such terrible situations if the problem is a lack of initial resources? The 6 countries that received the most economic aid from the U.S. are Afghanistan with $650 million in 2017, Jordan with $635 million, Kenya with $632 million, Tanzania with $534 million, Uganda with $435 million, Zambia with $428 million, and Nigeria with $413 million. In total, $3,727 million in 2017.
How about a little more? No, that's a lot of damage!
Don't worry though, that's only about 15% of the economic aid given by the US that year. In the same year, Canada gave about $5 billion in foreign aid. As a matter of proportion, the US foreign aid amounts to about 1% of their national GDP, and Canadian economic foreign aid amounted to about 0.5% of our national GDP. Sounds like a small amount of money to us, but to the countries receiving these sums, it's a huge amount of cash, especially the US contributions. So why do I care? When looking at these numbers, it would seem as though we're giving out very little to give what would be quite a lot. The reason I care is not because I believe that 0.5% of Canada's GDP is going to be life or death for our economy. Growing socialism in our country is a far more worrisome problem to me, but I do care about the recipients of this money and the effects it has on them. There's also a selfish interest here. When we debilitate third world countries through foreign aid, we make sure that they will not be able to develop properly. In doing this, we deprive ourselves of all the new ideas that the people of these countries would come up with if they were able to become rich like we are. Possibly the biggest issue here is the corruption of the governments involved. More specifically, the receiving governments, since they're the ones actually misusing the money, but also the Western governments, as they're taking advantage of these foreign countries for political capital. To illustrate my point on corruption, let's take a look at what the receivers of economic foreign aid do with the money given to them. Fahim Uddin, a reporter who has worked in Afghanistan, said, "It is enough to walk for half an hour along the worn-out and rugged streets of Kabul to see a number of lush new buildings rising in the midst of dirty and decaying clay huts. This means that there are some people who know how to make money out of the scarce resources this poor country possesses. There are basically only 2: drug trafficking and foreign aid." His statement implies that the benefit of foreign aid is not spread around in Afghanistan, but is instead concentrated in the hands of those who know how to work the system. Another excellent example is North Korea. The Kim family tyrants have acquired immense wealth through foreign aid, mainly from China, but also from Western countries. This aid was given under the pretense that it would be used for food and economic growth in the country, but what do the Kims actually do with said money? Well, take a look at their totally necessary ski resort and private pool. How about Un's private yacht, or the $30 million a year he spends on fine alcohol? Check out this indoor movie theater that could apparently seat up to 1,000. How about this mansion? You think it doubles as a bomb shelter? Aren't you glad your tax money's paying for Little Rocket Man to have all the finest in luxury? Not to mention that much of the aid given to North Korea goes straight towards its military. For my third example, we're going to look at misuses of foreign money in African countries. A 2013 paper published in Political Research Quarterly studied the use of foreign aid by Uganda. The money received was meant to help increase healthcare in the country, and it was indeed spent on healthcare. The kicker? They simply diverted their own spending that was formerly used on healthcare towards other things, like their military, which saw a huge funding increase following the aid. Use of such tactics allows basically any government receiving aid to spend said aid on whatever they like. Africa also sees the same type of problem that North Korea and Afghanistan have, where the privileged few know how to take advantage of foreign resources, but the average citizen sees very little of the aid. This problem is even more pronounced in the autocratic countries, but is still a major problem in the corrupt democracies of Africa. The government corruption in wealthy countries is also a major source of the issue here. The reason it's not quite as bad in my eyes is some people really are just trying to help, but are too naive to understand that free stuff will never work. The corrupt individuals in government like giving foreign aid for two major reasons. They're able to use their generosity as a talking point, and they're able to buy support from receiving governments. Just look at Western leaders when they go to third world countries and speak with the corrupt leaders as though they're anything less than reprehensible. Theresa May in South Africa is the most recent example I can think of. It is also possible for corrupt officials to skim some of the money that is meant for foreign countries through things like non-profit organizations, Clintons, excuse me, or by simply contracting one's own friends to do the work the money is meant to pay for. I'd be simply lying if I said the cultures of receiving countries were not to blame in some way. The people of these countries more or less consent to the abuse they receive, because they want the free stuff they are promised. I'm not saying they deserve what happens to them, but if they wanted to, they could change it. It is clear that those who govern require the consent of the governed, especially in a democratic country. South Africa is a country that holds elections. The people could vote out the worst politicians if they wanted to, but the allure of free things is enough for the majority of South Americans to vote for the actual communists in the ANC and the AFF. This is of course not just a strategy in South Africa, but all over the continent and in the Middle East. Rhodesia fell to the same tactics in the late 70s and began land reform as Zimbabwe in the 80s, and Ethiopia has tried similar reforms and had similar results. By succumbing to the prospect of free stuff, the people of Africa allow their corrupt officials to take advantage of them, and the cycle of oppression continues. If Africans want to become rich like the West, they need to change their perspective on how wealth is obtained. The idea that the West is rich because they are lucky is destructively propagated by left-wing politicians and members of the media in rich countries. You want proof? Well, remember Black Panther? Why was Wakanda rich? Was it because of their advanced culture? Certainly not, since the ruler was decided through a contest of brute force and heredity. Was it because they traded with as many nations as possible? Nope. They basically did the exact opposite by hiding their existence from everyone else, and if anything, leeching off the inventions of the rest of the world. They were rich because a meteorite landed at that location, and that meteorite just so happened to be full of what was basically magic. That's it. They got lucky. This is a perspective of the left today. They don't think you get rich through action, only luck and oppression. The Middle East really has its own set of problems. Now, this also applies to North Africa in some way, but not quite as much. These problems mostly stem from their willingness to be ruled by theocratic regimes that justify themselves through fear-mongering about Western powers. Not to say our governments haven't given them the tools for this by constantly meddling with them through wars and political bullshit, though. One of the prerequisites for real economic growth is that the population is willing to adapt to a new system. In the case of third world countries today, the countries either aren't safe enough for people to properly adapt, or they simply aren't willing to, because of the foreign aid we give them. Westerners tend to believe that if we give the poor people enough money, they'll become rich, like us. But that's just a band-aid. We don't tend to see why the poorest nations are poor. All we see are the sad pictures of starving children and assume that the money we give actually goes to them, when in reality it simply lines the pockets of corrupt politicians and the upper classes in those countries. Any economics student should be able to explain Rostow's 5 stages of economic development. I'll go through them now for anyone who's unaware. First is the subsistence phase, when almost everything produced is consumed immediately, leaving nothing to save for the future. Phase 2 involves the preconditions for takeoff being met. These are as more food can be produced and more resources are saved, a smaller proportion of the population is forced to work in agriculture, allowing other members of the society to create other goods and services. Once an economy starts to diversify away from solely producing food, it is in the 4th stage, the drive to maturity. And finally, the 5th stage is that of widespread mass consumption. At this point, most people are not involved in food production and instead work in making other goods and services that make people wealthy, TVs and such. The idea behind foreign economic aid is that with this aid, poor countries can skip the first 2 steps and go straight to the takeoff stage. But what actually happens is these nations get stuck in the first stage indefinitely, or at least unable to get out of it any faster. We make the assumption that these nations have populations that are ready for economic growth on a large scale, but they aren't. In short, economic aid is a form of national welfare. It does nothing to help the people involved, and only serves to keep the beneficiaries stuck in the same or worse situation they were in before. At least without the welfare, they had the opportunity to develop over time, but through these payments, we've taken even that away from them. So how do we actually help them if giving free money doesn't work? The same can be said for Mexico, the Middle East, and poor South American countries. There are so many opportunities for growth in these places, but they are only taken advantage of by a very small proportion of the population. So if you want to help, the best thing you can do is try to change the perspective of the people you know on foreign aid. Things will never change until we change our outlook on the third world. In my eyes, poverty can be eradicated within a few generations, maybe sooner, but this can't happen without people in the West changing how we see the rest of the world. Well, that's it for me. Thanks for watching, and if you want more content, go ahead and subscribe. If you have any ideas on what would make a good video in the future, or thoughts on this one, please leave a comment below. Have a good one.